pieced together from bits of nightmares, Mary Shelley's creation began the horror of the Victorian age.
It's alive! It's alive!
The Frankenstein monster still haunts us today. Next on Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
And now, once again, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. I have an affection for it was the offspring of happy days, when death and grief were but words, which found no true echo in my heart.
The 19th century, and especially the Victorian age, saw the birth of the great horror stories which still play a huge part in global culture, more huge than ever, in fact. They've even become absorbed into the language, a Frankenstein monster, a Jekyll and Hyde personality, a vampiric relationship, and so on, which is a sure sign that they've become an accepted part of everyday life. These stories represent the greatest contribution by British authors of the 19th century to the mass culture of this century, and I mean mass. Books, plays, films, videos, comics, advertisements, everything from novels to breakfast cereal packets. Where did they originate from? And why have they stayed so very, very famous? Why is their combination of desire and loathing, strangely mixed, so popular? And what's happened to them as they've been transformed over the last century or century and a half into something else? The long-term origins of these stories go back to classical Greece and Rome, if not earlier. But the origins of modern horror begin right here in the unlikely and affluent setting of the shores of Lake Geneva. It was here that in June 1816, the 18-year-old Mary Godwin, later to become Mary Shelley, was enjoying a summer tour of the alpine scenery, walking through the vineyards and forests of the lakeside, and staying in this villa overlooking Lake Geneva. Frankenstein, the first modern horror story, was born in the upper bedroom when Mary Godwin had a horrifying dream. It was here, on the 15th or 16th of June, 1816, that Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin had her terrifying nightmare. A half-waking, half-sleeping dream, as she put it, in which her daytime thoughts about science and birthing became a nighttime story which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature. She tried hard to blot it out by concentrating on the wooden shutters and the wash basin, and also by focusing on the Alps outside and the sky. But she just couldn't get it out of her mind. The science came from conversations she'd had about the spark of life and where it came from just before going to bed. But the birthing came from her own sad experience. For Mary's mother had died just 15 days after giving birth to her, and in 1815, Mary had lost her own little girl, born prematurely. The elements of Mary Godwin's bad dream had started in her impressionable young mind some years before. In 1814, Mary, who was then 16, had eloped with her boyfriend, the 21-year-old poet Percy Shelley, who was married at the time. Their journey was, as she put it, an act of love, youth and fearlessness. And they made their way through the heartland of romantic Europe, the River Rhine, a favourite subject of fashionable painters and poets of the day. Mary had just discovered she was pregnant, and they only had £25 and a box full of books between them. The experience stayed with her, as she noted in her private journal.
The Rhine is violently rapid, and though interrupted by no rocks, is swollen by high waves. Each tower-crowned hill, each picturesque ruin, each shadowy ravine and beetling precipice was passed and gazed upon with eager curiosity and delight. The very names of the titles of volumes of romance. Beyond, the sunset was illuminating the mountains and the clouds and casting the reflection of its hues on the agitated river. All the spirits of old Germany haunt the place.
When they reached the town of Gernsheim, Mary and Percy left the boat behind for a few hours and went for a long walk towards the foothills of Magnetberg Mountain. Here they could see the ruined walls and fortifications of yet another castle on top of a wooded hill. This castle had a legend of an alchemist called Johann Conrad Dippel, born here in 1673, who'd sought an elixir of life by distilling the essence of animal blood and human bones and selling it under the name Dippel's Oil. Dippel's research laboratory was said to be here, in this tower. The castle was called the Rock of the Franks, or Frankenstein. Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley also visited Neuchâtel, the home of these robots, or automata, made by local clockmakers in the 1780s and still going strong. They were toured across Europe in a blaze of publicity, and whenever they gave a performance, they raised some of the big questions of the day. Could the behavior of people be simulated by artificial means? What did make humans tick? One mechanical boy left a mind-boggling message to posterity in neat 18th century handwriting. I think, therefore I am.
One of the phenomena which peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame. Whence, I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has ever been considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries?
Mary Godwin was raised by her father, the radical philosopher William Godwin, who would continue to have a profound influence on her ideas for the rest of her life. He taught her to be both fascinated and terrified by the latest technology. Fascinated because it was new and potentially liberating, terrified because it was likely to get into the wrong hands and become an uncontrollable metal monster. Mary's late mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had written of nature as something to be treated with kindness and respect, rather than something for men to exploit and destroy. So Mary Godwin, a vegetarian, grew up thinking hard about the dark, satanic mills of the first industrial revolution. In the years just before the writing of Frankenstein, 1814 to 16, the key debate of the moment, which had been the subject of public lectures at the Royal College of Surgeons here in London, was about the origins of the principle of life itself. Now, on the one hand, there was the traditional view that life originated with a vital spark analogous to electricity, a vital spark which kick-started the soul and which ultimately came from God. Rather like Michelangelo's creation of Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That sort of thing. That was the traditional view. The new view was that life was a mere assemblage of functions of the body, bits and pieces of material that needed a new label to describe them, the word biology. This was an early version of the theory of evolution. No vital spark, no kick-starting of the soul, just parents. Mary Godwin was taken to sensational public demonstrations of the new power of electricity, or galvanism. The Italian scientist Luigi Galvani had sparked these off in 1791 when he started experimenting with dead frogs by prodding metal rods linked up to a galvanic battery into the muscles of the animal. As the frog's legs twitched, Galvani concluded that the electric current was in the animal rather than the rods. Galvani's nephew went even further in his experiments by applying an electric current to the corpse of a murderer who'd been hanged at Newgate just 1 hour before. Demonstrations of this kind seem to have affected Mary deeply. She'd gone to one of them when heavily pregnant, and after the tiny premature baby died, she'd written in her journal that she dreamt her dead child had only been cold, and that it was rubbed and prodded back to life again. In summer 1816, Mary Godwin's nightmare brought all these influences together into one unforgettable story.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
The weather had turned nasty, and Mary and Percy were cooped up inside this elegant 18th century villa. They'd come to visit the superstar poet, George Gordon, Lord Byron, who was renting the house, but tensions between them soon began to show. Mary's excitable stepsister, Claire, had come halfway across Europe to announce to Byron that she was pregnant by him. Furious, Byron, mad, bad and dangerous to know, responded with the question, "Is the brat mine?" Dr. John Polidori, Byron's companion and physician, was a humourless man who fancied himself as a bit of a poet, but was seriously outclassed in the company and eminently teasable. Mary, meanwhile, suspected that Percy might be having an affair with Claire, while Byron rather hoped he was. When these highly strung people started passing the time by telling each other ghost stories as a kind of family bet, the result was one of the most bizarre evenings in the history of world literature. The story of the writing of Frankenstein is almost as famous as the book itself and has become a myth in its own right.
How beautifully dramatic! The crudest, savage exhibition of nature at her worst without. And we three, we elegant three within. I should like to think that an irate Jehovah was pointing those arrows of lightning directly at my head, the unbowed head of George Gordon, Lord Byron, England's greatest sinner. But I cannot flatter myself to that extent. Possibly those thunders of our dear Shelley, heaven's applause for England's greatest poet.
What of my Mary?
She is an angel.
You think so?
And yet you have written a tale that sent my blood into icy creeps. Look at her, Shelley. Can you believe that bland and lovely brow conceived of Frankenstein? A monster created from cadavers out of rifled graves?
Such an audience needs something stronger than a pretty little love story. So why shouldn't I write of monsters?
The real story of the telling of Frankenstein took place not in a vast baronial hall, but here in Byron's holiday villa, the Villa Diodati, in the living room on the first floor.
It all began with this book, a collection of ghost stories called Phantasmagoriana, translated from the original German into French and published some 4 years before. Lord Byron managed to get hold of a copy and, taking his cue from the second story in the collection, suggested in a playful spirit that they should each have a hand at trying a tale of terror for themselves. What happened next was recalled by Mary Godwin, by then Mary Shelley, in print some 15 years later. They were all cooped up in the villa because of incessant rain, she says, and 4 of them took part in the ghost story session. But the illustrious poets soon got bored with the game and gave up. She, meanwhile, was frantically busying herself to think of a story. Each morning I was asked, "Have you thought of a story?" And each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative. Eventually, she came up with the creation sequence of Frankenstein, which shocked and surprised everyone, as well it might. Well, it was quite a cliffhanger and a pretty good story in itself. Trouble is, in fact, it didn't happen like that at all. The diary of Dr. John William Polidori, written at the exact time of the incidents described, and not 15 years later, tells a very different story. There were 5 people present, not 4, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Dr. Polidori, Claire Claremont, Mary's stepsister, and of course, Mary herself. The ghost story session was a lot less playful and well-mannered than in Mary's account. It was some kind of a bizarre encounter group with all of them getting on each other's nerves, frustrated at not being able to get out on the lake sailing, and Shelley feeling particularly highly strung. Meanwhile, Polidori rushed around ministering to them, ether for Shelley and black drop or opium for Byron. Above all, Polidori's diary shows that Mary was the first to tell her story, not the last. Trouble with Mary's account is that it suggests that Frankenstein was just another ghost story born in a thunderstorm, when in fact it was and is much, much more than that. Well, whatever the truth of the matter, it does seem clear that when Mary told her story that night, she began with the now famous words, "It was on a dreary night of November
that I beheld my man completed, with an anxiety that almost amounted to agony. I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the window panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out. When, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing. His teeth of pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set.
As Mary reached the climax of her story of the birth of the beautiful creature, Polidori's diary says that Percy Shelley, who was evidently high on something, started hallucinating and thought he was going mad. He could scarcely believe his young girlfriend had come up with such a horrifying story.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
Across the other side of the lake from the Villa Diodati, British tourists began to gather at the Hôtel d'Angleterre and peer through rented telescopes in the hope of catching a glimpse of the notorious poet. Wild rumors began to circulate of free love, group sex, and even a league of incest involving Percy, Mary, George, Claire, and anyone else who cared to join in. When tablecloths were seen drying on the villa's balcony, the tourists were convinced they were the girls' knickers. For Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley, enough was enough. They decided to escape from the villa into the Alps. When they arrived at the alpine village of Chamonix and excitedly checked in at the Hôtel de Londres, Percy tried to persuade Mary to expand her tale of the birth of the beautiful creature. She was reluctant at first, lacking in confidence. But here, she began the lengthy process of writing a full-length novel, weaving into it her deepest thoughts and anxieties about science and society. Mary started not with the beginning of the book, but with the central section, the creature's wanderings around the Genevan countryside following rejection by his parent.
You'll buy it?
He may consist of other people's spare parts, but he still has the full range of human feelings and emotions.
Who are you? I can't harm you.
Then she described the creature's rejection by everyone else he meets and his lashing out at an unfriendly world. He resolves to destroy his creator's entire family if he can't have one of his own. In the process of writing, Mary came to identify herself more and more with the creature. Encouraged by Percy, she crammed her first book with her own and other people's ideas about politics, parents, and children.
Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley used to take their travelling library with them wherever they went, even on holiday. According to Mary's journal, she'd read one book a day, and sometimes even two, either before or after Percy had read them, so they could excitedly discuss their latest discoveries together of an evening in bed. Now, Frankenstein's been called an example of bibliogenesis, or birth by books, a living piece of literature stitched together from bits of other books as filtered through Mary Godwin's imagination. And for the long central section of the novel, where the creature describes his traumatic birth and upbringing as an outcast, Mary made full use of many of the books she'd read since leaving England. First of all, two key books by her parents. An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice by William Godwin, which told of the dangers of living alone too much and the importance of companionship, and The Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, the only point of contact Mary had with her mother, which stressed the value of a careful, humane upbringing. Now, Emile, or On Education, by the Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which had been read by all the poets that summer, would have told her all about how if society treats you as ugly, you become ugly. Not so much ugly to look at as ugly behind the eyes. And Milton's Paradise Lost, which the creature stumbles on in the story and can't stop talking about thereafter. He identifies with Adam, the first man, and then, when things get worse and worse, with Satan, the fallen angel. Finally, all these big issues, political, social, moral, poetic, all come into focus in the great meeting of the creature and the creator, and Mary needed a suitably desolate end-of-the-world location to set it in. She found it when, with Percy, she set out from here, the Hotel de Londres at Chamonix, for the Mer de Glace, the sea of ice in the shadow of Mont Blanc.
Nothing can be more desolate than the ascent of this mountain. The trees in many places have been torn away by avalanches, and some, half leaning over, present the appearance of vast and dreadful desolation. I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing towards me. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, that it was the wretch I had created. Devil, do not poison the air with sounds of malice. Leave me. I go, cried he. But remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
Two months later, Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley moved back to England and the village of Great Marlow on the Thames. At the end of December 1816, they were married in a rather downbeat ceremony because it was still against both their principles to do so. When Mary mentioned the wedding in her journal, she even got the date wrong. So, this cottage at Great Marlow was their first real home together. It was here that Mary Shelley put the finishing touches to Frankenstein, and from here that Percy Shelley began to look for a publisher. It was, in fact, turned down by 3 publishing houses before it came out in spring 1818 in an edition of just 500 copies. Mary Shelley made the princely sum of £24 14 shillings on the deal, which can't have done much for the family finances. The first edition of Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, was published in 3 volumes, anonymously, with just a quotation from Adam in Milton's Paradise Lost on the title page. "Did I request thee, maker from my clay, to mould me man?" It was respectfully dedicated to Mary's father, William Godwin, author of Political Justice, etc. And perhaps for this reason, the earliest reviews in the conservative press tended to be cautious, to say the least. One of them said it was covertly promoting the passions and projects of the time and had to be treated with kid gloves. Another thought it was by Percy Shelley and full of poetic imagination. When it discovered the truth, it added, "For a man, it was excellent. For a woman, it was marvellous." The third panned the book, saying it was a tissue of disgusting absurdities, full of prose to make the flesh creep, which of course ensured its success, and led to the publication of another popular single-volume cut-down edition. It was Mary who did the cutting down, and this time the author's name, Mary W. Shelley, was proudly displayed on the title page. In this, the first ever Frankenstein illustration, presumably authorized by Mary herself, a terrified young research student in a cloak flees from a confused but still beautiful Adam-like creature. Frankenstein was given more of a conscience this time. There was less of the radicalism, and the emphasis shifted from Godwin's ideas about justice to making the flesh creep. Frankenstein had started on its journey from novel to popular myth. By the summer of 1823, the first stage version opened in London.
Oh, dear! Oh.
Frankenstein gains an exploding laboratory and a comic assistant called Fritz.
Oh, you're frightened out of your wits. Oh, what's that? What's that? Oh, it's only thunder. But if you ask my shrewd guess, it's my opinion that my master, like Dr. Faustus, is raising the devil. Oh! I say, I've got 2 loose teeth, and every time I go anywhere near that infernal laboratory, well, me head, it shakes like a dice box. Oh dear!
A German tourist wrote that the performances were over the top and the play was terrible, but the special effects were impressive.
If me legs don't lap under me, I'll make my escape. Oh!
Outside, on the streets, there was a demonstration calling on those who believed in traditional family values to boycott the play. But it was a fantastic success, and by that same autumn, 2 rival dramatisations were running in London, as well as 3 burlesque versions.
But with the mind of an infant.
Mary Shelley's complex and thoughtful fantasy about science and tolerance became a simple-minded parable about the dangers of playing God and a horror story about a grunting, incoherent monster.
Who approaches? Is that you, Fritz? Behold, the horrid corpse to which I have given life.
Mary herself saw an early performance, and to her surprise, rather enjoyed it. "I was much amused, and it appeared to excite a breathless eagerness in the audience," she wrote. Presumption, or the fate of Frankenstein, ran in the West End for years and made Mary infamous. A few years later, when the expression "a Frankenstein monster" had already been used in Parliament, the early steam locomotive, the Rocket, ran over and killed the politician who was opening the Liverpool-Manchester railway line. A
parody of Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus was rushed onto the London stage to cash in on the tragedy. Frankenstein or the modern promise to pay. The creature really had become an out-of-control industrial monster. But it was the invention of cinema which completed the process of transforming the novel into a modern, popular myth. The first movie version was the Edison Company's Frankenstein of 1910, an adaptation of the stage version which Mary Shelley had seen 85 years before. This very rare piece of film was thought until as recently as the 1970s to have been lost. Mary hadn't described the creation scene in any technical detail, so Edison had to fill the gap with a bubbling cauldron, some magic spells, and a spot of alchemy. Later, the manic monster terrifies his maker, as he is threatened, on his wedding night.
When this dead hand moves, the monster created by a man they called mad is turned loose to strike terror into the hearts of men.
When Hollywood was preparing the first Frankenstein with sound in 1931, Universal Studios decided to make the creature, or rather the monster as he now was, a lumbering patchwork human being made up of scars and stitches.
Story you heard about, talked about, the spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions. Frankenstein.
Originally, the studio had considered a whole range of design options, including the idea of a robot, a piece of mechanical rather than biological engineering. In the end, though, the designers seem to have opted for an image of the madhouse from a series of prints called Caprices of 1799 by the Spanish painter Goya. The huge dome-like forehead made him resemble, as did Goya's print, someone with a very serious pituitary problem, a picture of disability and monstrousness rather than of beauty.
I've started on brain surgery, Paul. Watch this. Get up. Come on, get up. That's right. Now come here. Come here. Sit. Sit down. Sit down.
This your creature of superior intellect, your perfect physical being. Ask it a question of advanced physics.
The story of Frankenstein has, over the last century and a half, and especially since the invention of films and television, turned into a kind of parallel version, with successive audiences filling in the gaps, ironing out problems in the plot, and selecting the bits that seem to work best in changing times. Always a creation scene with lots of bangs and flashes, always a grunting monster on the rampage, and always a spectacular, explosive finale. Now, in the process, the emphasis has shifted away from Mary Shelley's complex philosophical novel towards a mad scientist and a monster. And since 1931, the monster has always looked a little like Boris Karloff. He's a thing of scars and stitches and skewers with a bolt through his neck to plug him into. But he's become more and more user-friendly, like everyone's baby brother in an overdeveloped body, with a little bit of tender loving care, he can belong to anyone's family. And if a 10-year-old can eat it, use it, or watch it, the name of Frankenstein's monster is on it. A contemporary fairy tale for today's little monsters. As a poem for children recently put it, when I'm feeling lonely, for Igor I will send. We'll go to my laboratory and we will make a friend. Sweet. But there's something for me a little bit apprehensive in this attempt to tame the creature, as if what he represents in the folk memory, the dangers of modern science, the threat to the environment, needs to be made a little bit less scary. So, Mary Shelley's nightmare becomes a rubber mask.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
At the end of the book, Frankenstein relentlessly pursues the creature across Europe and the Black Sea to the icy wasteland of the Arctic, as far away from civilized society as it was possible for Mary Shelley to imagine. The creature has broken all the scientist's family ties by murdering his brother and his best friend and strangling his wife Elizabeth on their wedding night. But Victor Frankenstein dies of exhaustion, and the creature pays his last respects to his parent before disappearing into the whiteness. Only at this final moment can he find the words to articulate his deepest feelings of rejection and despair.
No sympathy may I ever find. When I first sought it, it was the love of virtue, the feelings of happiness and affection with which my whole being overflowed. But now that virtue has become to me a shadow, and that happiness and affection are turned into bitter and loathing despair. Once I falsely hoped to meet with beings who, pardoning my outward form, would love me for the excellent qualities which I was capable of unfolding. But now crime has degraded me beneath the meanest animal. The fallen angel becomes a malignant devil. I shall die. I shall no longer feel the agonies which now consume me. I shall no longer see the sun or stars, or feel the winds play on my cheeks. Light, feeling, and sense will pass away, and in this condition must I find my happiness.
Within 8 years of the Geneva summer of 1816, the summer that saw the creation of Frankenstein, all the men who'd taken part in that ghost story session at the Villa Diodati were dead. Dr. Polidori had poisoned himself. Percy Shelley had drowned when his yacht, the Ariel, capsized in a storm off the coast of Italy. And Lord Byron had died, a popular hero, in the cause of the liberation of Greece. So, by the age of 27, Mary Shelley felt, as she put it, as an old woman must feel, "I may love none but the dead." Of her 5 children, only 1 had survived infancy. She spent the rest of her life struggling to earn a living as a writer, petitioning Shelley's father for an allowance, falling out one by one with Shelley's friends, and developing close companionships with a few select women friends, and withdrawing slowly into herself and her books. She tried hard to be likable, but somehow couldn't quite make it. "A cold heart," she wrote in her journal, "have I a cold heart? God knows, but at least the tears are hot." Mary Shelley died in London at the age of 53 after a series of strokes on the 1st of February, 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition, a huge celebration of the wonders of science and technology. And she died having lived for over a quarter of a century in retrospect. Mary Shelley was buried here in St. Peter's Churchyard, Bournemouth, near the home of her surviving son. Her father, William Godwin, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, were exhumed from St. Pancras Churchyard, London, and reburied here, side by side with their daughter. Much later, they were joined by the heart of Percy Shelley, the rest of him having been cremated in Italy. A slice of his heart was buried in a little silver urn in this grave. Towards the end of her life, she revisited the Villa Diodati and looked up at it from the shores of Lake Geneva. Was I still the same person who'd lived here, she asked herself, the companion of the dead? For all were gone. Even my young child died in infancy. Storm and blight and death had destroyed all while I was still very young. But one thing survived all the storm and the blight, to take on a life of its own, which its creator would scarcely have recognized. The thing she called my hideous progeny, born in a dream. The story of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus.
I am Count Dracula.
Even today, the name strikes terror in the hearts of millions. Bram Stoker, the creator of The Count from Transylvania. Next time on Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror. Tomorrow night, JFK comes back again to steal the nation's heart on an all-new special presentation of biography at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific. Now, witness the nightmarish events surrounding the creation of Dracula, next on A&E.
I am Count Dracula.
Even today, the name strikes terror in the hearts of millions. But is the truth as frightening as the fiction? Bram Stoker, the creator of The Count from Transylvania, next on Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
Dracula is the most famous vampire novel of all time. It was first unleashed on a terrified public in 1897, the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and the year in which Sigmund Freud began his researches into psychoanalysis. In 1897, the author Bram, or Abraham Stoker, came to the end of a 7-year journey of the mind through a place he'd never visited called Transylvania, the land beyond the forest. On the surface, Bram Stoker was a pillar of late Victorian respectability, an ex-civil servant from Dublin and now manager of a West End theatre which specialised in spectacular productions of Shakespeare, and where he rubbed shoulders routinely with members of the artistic and political elite. But just below the surface, he had something on his mind. Bram Stoker's terrifying nightmare was a strange brew of 3 seductive vampires, his own personal hang-ups and repressions, and the witches from Macbeth.
In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women. I thought I must be dreaming. There was something about them that made me uneasy. Some longing, and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited. Suddenly, I was conscious of the presence of the Count. This man belongs to me.
But above all, Bram Stoker's nightmare was inspired by the literary tradition of the vampire, which had begun some 75 years earlier, here at the Villa Diodati on the shore of Lake Geneva. For in the stormy summer of 1816, 2 great horror stories had been born. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and an equally scary contribution from the poet Lord Byron.
On that dismal June evening, after Mary had told her story here in this very room, Lord Byron began a tale about an aristocrat of ancient family called Darvel, who travelled with a young acquaintance to Turkey and died in a graveyard there after promising to come back from the dead 1 month later. And there the tale tantalisingly ended. But it was resurrected 3 years later by Dr. John William Polidori, Byron's physician, who'd rewritten and embellished it anonymously and without permission under the title The Vampire, a Tale. Lord Byron was furious. From the little acquaintance I have of vampires, he wrote, I have a personal dislike of them. Polidori was in disgrace, and 3 years later, he died, probably a suicide, at the age of 25. The aristocratic vampire had been well and truly launched with the best possible credentials.
Polidori's Vampire was soon adapted as a melodrama in the early 1820s. The Bride of the Isles featured Lord Ruthven as a Scottish vampire, complete with kilt and tam o'shanter, causing havoc in the mists of the Highlands.
Phantom from our tomb so drear, at our bidding, swift arise!
A visitor to London, who'd come expecting a piece of great literature by Lord Byron, wrote, the acting was indeed acceptable throughout, but the piece is so stupid and monstrous that it was impossible to sit out the performance.
Arise, appear! Appear!
am Ribbon. Ribbon the vampire, and I come to claim my bride of the Isles. I must have my fearful sacrifice. I must have my bride, the Lady Margaret, my latest, choicest victim.
The hour has not yet come! Down, down, thou spirit!
To engineer the dramatic disappearance of the vampire, the very first stage trapdoor was used. It's still known in theatrical circles as the vampire trap. In 1847, the year Bram Stoker was born, the craze for vampire stories began to spread to a wider public than ever, in the form of a comic or penny dreadful, which came out in weekly parts. Varney the Vampire hugely expanded Polidori's slim tale, and to the basic idea of the bloodsucker, who turns his victims into the undead, introduced two new elements, an Eastern European count and the sexual initiation of the heroine when she's bitten. Just over 40 years later, in 1890, these ideas were picked up by an Irish ex-civil servant who transformed them into Dracula, a novel which synthesized all the elements of the vampire legend from folklore and literature and presented them for the first time in a modern, late Victorian setting. It took 6 years to write his masterpiece, and the whole intriguing process can be reconstructed from his private papers and notes. These were sold at Sotheby's in London in 1913, about a year after the death of the author, and eventually arrived here at the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia, where they only came to light as recently as the late 1970s. These papers are a unique historical record of Bram Stoker's thought processes and his researches as he prepared his masterpiece, Dracula. And here they are, the complete working notes and papers. They consist of 3 packets of papers, the first 2 in Bram Stoker's handwriting and the third typed on a very early typewriter. And together they represent the key to the writing of Dracula, because they enable us to piece together bit by bit in extraordinary detail exactly what was on Bram Stoker's mind. They begin on the 8th of March 1890 with that nightmare. A young man goes out, sees girls, one tries to kiss him, not on lips but throat. And then 6 days later, on the 14th of March 1890, Stoker goes back to that nightmare again. Is it a dream? Women stoop to kiss him. Terror of death. Suddenly, Count turns her away. This man belongs to me. We're back to the nightmare again. The papers go on to describe the places he visited, the books he read, and the thoughts he had between March 1890 and February 1896, a 6-year project. And the one consistent feature that runs right through the 6 years is that nightmare. To start with, the notes are diffuse and unconnected. No plot, no title, far too many minor characters, no Dracula, no Transylvania. But they begin to come into focus in summer 1890, when Bram Stoker went on his holidays to the little seaside town of Whitby on the northeast coast of England. Whitby was an ancient Yorkshire seaport and centre of such industries as whaling, shipbuilding and sail-making. Captain Cook learned his craft here. 5 months after he'd experienced his terrifying nightmare, Bram Stoker arrived on holiday in August 1890 and started compiling his detailed notes in earnest. He was joined by his wife Florence and their only child, Noel. A relative said of their marriage that Florence Stoker was a remote sort of person, cursed by her great beauty and the need to maintain it, and that her husband tended to retreat from her into a world of his own. So Stoker spent much of his time on holiday by himself. He talked to sailors and coast guards about the sea and heard a strange story about a Russian schooner called the Dmitri, which 5 years before had run into the harbour in the face of a storm with all sails up, by pure chance avoiding the rocks. Stoker was fascinated and duly stored the story up in his notes for future reference.
Oh, look! What? I thought I saw a ship. There! Oh, yes, I saw it. It's heading straight for the rocks. Oh, how terrible!
The wind suddenly shifted to the northeast and swept the strange schooner before the blast with all sails set. A shudder ran through all who saw her, for lashed to the helm was a corpse with drooping head, which swung horribly to and fro at each motion of the ship.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment.
Bram Stoker spent many hours walking through St. Mary's churchyard on the cliffs above the town. Like a civil service clerk with a morbid turn of mind, he carefully noted down 87 names and inscriptions from these graves, complete with footnotes. Thomas Davidson, drowned off the coast of Holland. Cornelius Usherwood, lost at sea. Anne Swales, died 6th February 1795. We hope our souls in heaven will dwell at last. It was at Whitby that Stoker first began to plot what was to become the central section of his story, of a vampire from the east who arrives in a deserted schooner, the Demeter rather than the Dmitri, to colonize the west. Here in St. Mary's, the vampire attacks his first victim on English soil, Lucy Westenra, who will, as a result, become one of the undead.
I could see the seat and the white figure, for I was now close enough to distinguish it even through the spells of shadow. There was undoubtedly something long and black bending over the half-reclining white figure. I called in fright, "Lucy!"
For the character of his villain, Stoker needed to look no further than the Lyceum Theatre off the Strand in London. The actor-manager, Henry Irving, was a man he both worshipped and feared. Stoker had been working for him at the Lyceum as business manager, public relations officer, and, as he put it, loyal and devoted servitor for 10 long and grueling years. It was a job which began at breakfast time and ended late in the evening, much of the time in between being spent looking after and flattering Henry Irving's gigantic ego.
Now, it may be that Stoker's relationship with this dominating man, on the one hand hero worship and on the other exploitation, provided him with the central idea for the novel he was working on. Dracula would certainly have been a part which Henry Irving could have got his teeth into.
Bram Stoker had to do much of his writing in hotel bedrooms while on tour with the Lyceum Company, or on his annual summer break. Even then, it wasn't uncommon for Henry Irving to summon him back to the Strand at short notice. Every year from 1893 onwards, he chose to take a holiday here on the bleak coastline of northeast Scotland at the little-known fishing village of Port Errol, now Cruden Bay. The locals remembered him as a humourless, preoccupied sort of figure who would shout at the sea when he went for his solitary walks. On his first visit, he fell in love with the place and stayed at the local hotel, the Kilmarnock Arms. Sitting alone in his room and trying to concentrate on a new Lyceum production of Macbeth, Bram Stoker had trouble getting that nightmare of the strong man and his sexy predatory disciples out of his system. In this state of mind, he started the hard slog of drafting Dracula. But Stoker was looking for a big opening for his story. He wandered further north along the Buchan coast and came across Slains Castle, built in the early 17th century, the residence of the Earls of Errol, which seemed to grow out of the sheer granite rocks. He'd already written of the vampire's dramatic arrival in England. Now he wanted to construct the events which came before the Whitby shipwreck, today the best-known section of the novel. His young hero, the solicitor's clerk, Jonathan Harker, arrives at the home of the vampire count, a vast ruined castle perched on a rock.
Welcome to my house, Mr. Harker. Come freely, go safely.
Count Dracula?
I am Count Dracula. Will you come in? And please, leave here some of the happiness you bring.
Suddenly, I became conscious of the fact that I was in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky. I could see even in the dim light that the stone was massively carved, but that the carving had been much worn away by time and weather. I began to rub my eyes and pinch myself to see if I were awake. It all seemed like a horrible nightmare to me. What sort of a place had I come to? What sort of grim adventure was it on which I had embarked?
But it was here, in the circular reading room of the British Museum, that Bram Stoker made most of the detailed discoveries which fleshed out his holiday researches. On the very first page of Dracula, he wrote, "Having some time at my disposal in London, I visited the British Museum and made search among the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania." Exactly what he did. Now, originally, he'd intended to set the book in Styria, part of Austria, but it was reading then fashionable books such as these which made him change his mind. The Land Beyond the Forest by Emily Gerard, who was the wife of a serving officer in the Austro-Hungarian cavalry, a book which argued that Transylvania might be termed the very land of superstition. 2 volumes. And then The Book of Werewolves by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, the man who wrote the hymn Onward Christian Soldiers, as well as about 100 books, which had lots of facts and figures about the behavior of wolves and of people who turned into wolves. "Listen to them, the children of the night," says the Count in the novel. "What music they make." Well, the music came from this book. But the most important discovery that Bram Stoker made in the British Museum was this: a pamphlet published in Bamberg, Germany in 1491, chronicling the campaigns of Vlad Dracula, Vlad IV, with a woodcut portrait on the cover. It told of Dracul's campaigns against the Turks, roughly the same time as Richard III was ruling England. Had nothing to do with vampirism at all. Vlad seems to have preferred impaling or roasting his victims. But this book certainly provided Stoker with the physical description of Count Dracula.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early the next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but the train was an hour late. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What ought they to be in China? Beyond the green, swelling hills of the Mittelland rose mighty slopes of forest, up to the lofty steeps of the Carpathians themselves.
Jonathan Harker's journey was a case of tourism of the mind, based on reading and fantasizing in London, rather than first-hand experience in the wilds of Eastern Europe. The details of the journey, from timetables, hotels, even the recipe for chicken paprika, were transposed, sometimes word for word, from printed sources such as Baedeker's Tourist Guide to Hungary and Transylvania, and turned into the Journal of Jonathan Harker.
It was on the dark side of twilight when I finally got to Bistritz, which is a very interesting old place. I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling came over me. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense.
Stoker wasn't writing about the real landscape and people of Romania. He preferred an imaginary place where forelock-tugging villagers crossed themselves in the foothills of the castle. Wolves howl, garlic flowers hang from every door, and the dark Germanic forest is full of things that go snap in the night. Fashionable late 19th century travel writers described the real Carpathian Mountains as a place where you leave the advanced west and enter the more primitive east. And where, as one of them put it, within this mountain rampart, the whole species of demons, witches and hobgoblins has taken refuge, driven from the rest of Europe by the wand of science. Stoker's novel was laced with ideas from traditional peasant stories, such as those about the Nosferatu, a Romanian word for vampire, told and retold from generation to generation.
To Victorian readers who lapped up romantic travellers' tales of Eastern Europe, the villages of the Carpathian Mountains were synonymous with folk tales, or superstitions as they called them, of the dead coming back to life, of wolves and werewolves, they're the ones who are hairy on the inside, of the eve of St. George's Day when all hell broke loose, and most of all, of the vampire or Nosferatu. Now, these folk tales really grew out of the changing rhythms of agricultural life, the changing seasons of the year, age-old funerary customs, the fear of wolves. And the vampire of folklore was usually a ruddy-faced agricultural labourer with a serious breath problem, for fairly obvious reasons, who was as likely to come back to bite his sheep and cows as he was to molest his relatives. But what the undead actually did when they sank their teeth into their victims' necks seems to have confused everyone. In horror stories, and most of the movies based on them, the vampire uses his upper set of canines,
sinks them into the victim's neck and leaves 2 telltale marks through which he drinks. But if he'd done that, he'd probably have got his upper set stuck in, and by the time he'd extricated them, the holes would have been very wide apart. In folklore, the vampire uses the upper and lower canines on one side of the mouth, captures a little piece of skin in between, and tears at the flesh like a rodent or a wolf. Now, this skull of a wolf can make the process clear. Now, these little teeth, the incisors, are the teeth which slice. But these bigger teeth, the upper and lower canines, are the teeth which tear. Very nasty indeed. So not only was the vampire of fiction promoted to the upper set of society, he only used his upper set of teeth as well. But whatever his modus operandi, he was known in this part of the world by 2 names, and 2 names only: Nosferatu or Vampire.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
This is the real-life homeland of the 15th century Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, whose portrait Stoker had seen on a late medieval pamphlet in the British Museum. His castle was deliberately built to be as difficult as possible for his enemies to reach. In Bram Stoker's version, Dracula is a count who lives in Transylvania. As a matter of historical fact, Vlad was a voivod, or prince, whose ruined castle lies 150 miles south, here in the remote mountains of Wallachia. In the novel, Stoker teased his readers with the admission, "I wasn't able to light on any map giving the exact locality of Castle Dracula." This, the real Castle Dracula, was only identified with certainty 25 years ago, in the early 1970s. But far from being a satanic majesty, Vlad IV was an Orthodox Christian who earned his name Dracula, meaning son of the devil or son of the dragon, in a series of ferocious holy wars against the armies of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. On the walls of this glittering local monastery are portraits of Vlad's successors, the voivods of Wallachia, who continued the struggle against what were seen as the forces of darkness. Back in England, and back in the novel, after Dracula has arrived by ship, his contagion begins to spread like the plague. And the focus of the story shifts away from Whitby and the Count himself towards London, Highgate Cemetery, and the problem of how do you get rid of vampires, something with which Stoker seems to have become obsessed. The second half of the novel has various undead predators being staked through the heart with a piece of holy wood and turning back into happy corpses. In preparing this latter part of his novel, Bram Stoker was inspired by a real-life story he'd heard about the poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Now, Rossetti, whom Stoker knew, they'd been close neighbours, was in fact a nephew of Dr. John William Polidori, and he'd buried a little book of love poems in the coffin of his late wife Elizabeth Siddal here in Highgate Cemetery. A splendidly romantic gesture. 7.5 years later,
Rossetti changed his mind and decided to publish his poems. So he got Home Office permission to have the body exhumed and the book retrieved. One night, a fire was built by this graveside. The coffin was raised, the lid was opened, and Rossetti removed the book from the locks of golden hair in which he'd entwined it. Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal was described as perfectly preserved and still beautiful, with a kind of spectral halo about her as she came to light.
For a moment or two, that is, when the book of poems was lifted, some of the red golden hair came away in Rossetti's hands, and the body began to decompose on contact with the air.
But in Bram Stoker's hands, this story turned into something very different. It turned into a way of disposing of Lucy Westenra after she died and returned from the dead as a sexy, full-blooded vampire.
De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine, Domine exaudi vocem meam. Fiantoris tui intendendis et lux perpetua lucete. It is done.
Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror, will return in a moment. We now return to Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
Having brought together his research notes and jottings for the novel, which itself took the form of jottings and press cuttings and journal and diary entries, Bram Stoker decided at the very last minute to change the title from The Undead, or The Dead Undead, to Dracula. It was published in June 1897, price 6 shillings, in a stylish yellow and red binding, 3,000 copies. And then, 3 years later, in 1901, it was reissued as a sixpenny paperback in an abridged form with the only illustration that Bram Stoker himself ever authorized. It's the military commander again, this time shinning down the walls of Castle Dracula, looking like an oversized bat with giant webbed feet. Bram Stoker went on to write 7 more novels and 3 works of non-fiction, but none of them came near Dracula in originality, success, or quality.
To protect the theatrical copyright of his novel by turning it into a play, Bram Stoker arranged a semi-dramatized reading on the stage of the Lyceum Theatre just before the book reached the bookshops.
The final scene.
The whole Dracula industry began here, with a show consisting of 5 acts and 47 scenes.
Dangerous to all of us, and from all sides.
A Mr. Jones played Dracula, and it lasted nearly 5 hours.
Meanwhile, I find my way.
Here, finally, was a chance for Stoker to impress his boss with something he had achieved. But Henry Irving, who listened to the reading, stormed out at the end, declaring in a loud voice that the work was dreadful. His devoted servitor, who desperately wanted to please, must have been crushed.
Which has blighted all our lives.
The same year that Dracula was published, 1897, was the year that Sigmund Freud began his researches into psychoanalysis, and the novel's often been interpreted since then as a parable of repressed sexual desires. One Freudian has called it a kind of incestuous, necrophilious, oral, anal, sadistic, all-in wrestling match, which basically means that anything goes. Others have related it to the Oedipus complex, Dracula as daddy, or to a paranoia about liberated women who quite literally get put back in the box, or to a yearning to break every taboo in the business, especially taboos concerning blood, a case of stop it, I like it. One reason why the novel has remained so popular with adolescents, it's been argued, is because it's about sex from the neck up. Sex without guilt, without responsibility, without pregnancy, sex which lasts forever, sex which doesn't even need to be mentioned. Not exactly safe sex, but you can't have everything. Bram Stoker himself would have been absolutely amazed at all this analysis. A great fan of censorship, he once wrote, "The only emotions which in the long run lead to harm are those which arise from the sex impulse. To judge by Count Dracula, too much indulgence leads to hairy palms, a pallid complexion, and very bloodshot eyes." It's likely that Stoker thought of his book as a simple adventure story about a gang of fine upstanding chaps who defend their womenfolk against the nasty Eastern Europeans who would make Britain part of their evil empire. But that, of course, doesn't begin to explain what's made Dracula so very, very popular. Bram Stoker never lived to see the success of Dracula on stage or screen. After his death, Florence Stoker showed how sensible he'd been to try and protect the copyright, when in 1922 she attempted to get some form of payment from a German film company for the first version of Dracula called Nosferatu, directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau. The company had adapted the book, changing the names of the characters, but without asking anyone's permission. So Mrs. Stoker sued, and when the producers went out of business, she got a German court to rule that all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed. Fortunately for us, if not for her, one print survived in Germany. The film is now reckoned to be one of the classics of early cinema. The Vampire Count has been transformed from a military commander into a bald-headed, emaciated creature of folklore with the ears of a bat and the fangs of a rat. He's the creature referred to by one critic as a penis with teeth.
No one leave. Move on at your patter. We will not stop until we have discovered the vampires.
But it was Hollywood that projected Dracula onto a world stage and made the Count truly immortal.
Watch out! They may be hovering over you. Or you. Or you!
On Valentine's Day 1931, Universal Studios' Dracula, billed as the strangest love story of all, made a superstar of the well-fed, Hungarian-accented Bela Lugosi. He didn't resemble Bram Stoker's description at all, and he had difficulty speaking his lines in the English language, but he made the part his own.
The original terrifying story of a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
A quarter of a century and several sequels later, it was the turn of England and Hammer films, with Christopher Lee as a more athletic and aristocratic vampire who did his biting in colour. Dracula has appeared in more films than any other character in the literature of horror. Over 200 of them, in fact, and that's not counting cartoons and comedies, and he's still by no means out for the count. As a corporate image,
consisting of fangs and cloak and black tie and pallor, the uniform of the lounge lizard, he's appeared on a staggering amount of merchandise, a sure sign that he's entered the bloodstream of modern culture.
Bram Stoker died in London on the 20th of April 1912, in the same week as the Titanic went down on its maiden voyage to America. He was 64 years old, and his death certificate declared the cause of death to be exhaustion. He was cremated here at Golders Green in North London, where his ashes still remain in a nondescript marble urn. It had been a quiet funeral, and he left just £4,700. But he left something else as well. He left a story which laid down the ground rules for countless adaptations and sequels and parodies. The ground rules for a whole industry in the 20th century. No one can write a vampire story, or it could be argued a mass-market horror story of any description, without acknowledging the sheer power of Dracula. Today, we can confront the dark themes of Stoker's novel head-on in ways he just couldn't imagine. Dead words like contagion, repression, dependency, sexual initiation, and so on. But we still seem to prefer the metaphor of vampires, the fairy story version. So Dracula has taken on a life of its own and long since flown away from the literary world altogether. The Count has been so successful that he simply won't lie down.
I hereby summon to this place next week every person within the sound of my voice.
There are two sides to every coin.
Me!
'Twas Robert Louis Stevenson, the real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Next time on Nightmare, the birth of Victorian horror.
I'm Karen Stone. Her charismatic style and grace has left an indelible mark on the presidential elections. First lady or not, her tireless campaigning will still leave her a winner. The life of the woman who could be a big part of our future. Elizabeth Dole is our biography this week. Next on A&E.